Bom, gente, contente de estar com vocês aqui. A gente teve uma parada aí nos fóruns do LGP por conta da greve, agora a gente voltou a operar esse mês e a gente está muito feliz que a gente trouxe para esse primeiro fórum o professor David Snowden. Ele vai fazer uma palestra para a gente bastante interessante. O pessoal está chegando ainda, mas a gente vai trabalhar aqui no horário para garantir aí a audiência do pessoal das nossas comunidades, tanto os alunos do CGP, como o pessoal que participa do Laboratório de Gestão de Projeto, o pessoal que acompanha os fóruns online. Então a gente vai começar já a apresentação. O David Snowden, ele é fundador e chefe científico, né, da Cognitive Edge Limitada. Ele também é um palestrante muito conhecido, vários de vocês já devem ter tido, inclusive, a oportunidade de ver alguns vídeos dele no YouTube, bastante interessante. E ele vai provocar aqui a gente como é que a gente muda um pouco aquele paradigma de gestão de projeto, principalmente no ambiente de software, mudando para um ambiente mais de aprendizado, onde a gestão de conhecimento é mais importante, saindo um pouco daquele paradigma muito da manufatura tradicional. David, we're so glad to have you here, and now they are yours.
Just check everybody can hear me. I hate having to carry these things, all right? I'm not a pop star. Right? First of all, if I start to speak too quickly, slow me down, right? I'm Welsh, not English. That's important to understand, all right? Now you know that to call me English is a deadly insult. My children will seek out your children unto the 7th generation. Right? But in Wales, we speak the language very, very quickly. Right? So slow me down. Right? What I want to do is to introduce 2 or 3 core concepts and think about their implications for projects. And I'm going to focus mainly on IT projects, but the lessons are more general. Yeah? My own background, my original degree is a joint honours in physics and philosophy. That gives me a philosopher's delight of argument and a physicist's contempt for social science. And you'll see that come through, right? Do not buy qualitative research in any way whatsoever. And then really after a variety of careers, I actually designed and built software for decision support systems and then moved from that into general management. I've set up 3 software businesses in my life. This is the first time I've done it for myself rather than for other people, so that's my background. Yeah? My role historically, and it's summarized by this cartoon, is to be a constructive irritant. I've always taken a science-based approach to life, which means I'm very happy to challenge things if I think they're wrong, and I've never worried about people getting upset. Right? In my family, if we like you, we argue with you. If we're polite to you, it means we're not sure about you yet. Right? And I've sort of taken that across into business life. I should really have briefed my wife about this before I introduced her to the family. It was okay until they decided I liked it. So that's kind of like life. And one of the things which worries me a lot about management practice in general, management science in particular, and the whole of the software development industry, particularly those people involved in Agile. How many people know about Agile? Okay, it's very subjective. It's very subject to trendy methods. In fact, if I'm honest about it, Agile seems to be an excuse for people to create training revenue rather than do anything radically different. Yeah? And what we got is a phenomenon which a friend of mine, Brian, has called Gladwellism, a deliberate attack and a justified attack on Malcolm Gladwell. And I'll read it. The hard sell of a big theme supported by dubious, incoherent, but dramatically presented evidence. Yeah? And you see it's an awful lot at the moment. People pick 1 or 2 examples, and from that they create a general recipe and argue if you follow this recipe, you too will be successful. If anybody's come across SAFE yet, Scaled Agile Framework, okay, well, we'd be grateful if you avoid it. It's, SAFE is Prince 2 disguised in Agile clothing, right? It's an attempt to try and create a simple training revenue approach based on taking every single bit of software development theory which has an attractive name and put it into a very big complicated diagram and say, now we've solved the problem. I'll come back to scaling later here in terms of the way we worked. So, as I say, I'm nervous about this because also it tries to take an empirical model of research which is highly appropriate for Newtonian physics and highly inappropriate for modern physics or social systems. So in Newtonian physics, you observe repeating phenomena. From that, you derive general rules, and you can then rely on those rules repeating. Well, that kind of like doesn't work for quantum mechanics, and it definitely doesn't work for human systems. Human systems are constantly flexing and constantly changing. There's a known phenomenon called the Hawthorne effect, which means if you do anything novel in a human system, it nearly always works the first time. And the trouble is, people get something to work, then they think they've got a repeating pattern where actually they don't. Now, there are good scientific reasons behind that, and I want to go through them. Yeah? So the first thing I want to introduce is this basic concept of sense-making. And sense-making I define as how do we make sense of the world so that we can act in it. Now, with that comes a concept of sufficiency. It's how do I know enough that I can act. And one of the major problems we have in software development is that we actually over-define before we move into development. We assume that users know what they want, or at least within constraints. We assume that systems analysts, through interviewing people, can discover what people need, and then we assume we can engineer a solution. And 20 years of failure in large software products hasn't taught us the lesson that this won't work. And one of the problems is we're getting the starting point wrong. Yeah? We're not understanding that human needs and requirements are evolutionary in nature. A large amount of software development, the minute we give people things, they suddenly realize they want something different. Yeah, we develop user requirement definitions in software so that users could sign up to something they didn't understand and we could hold them accountable for later. And I'm not being cynical, I'm being literal. Yeah? The reality is technology creates needs that people didn't have until they used the technology. So basically, technology and need has to be a co-evolutionary process. Not only that, needs and capabilities don't always match with strategic goals. I'll come back later. If we're going to scale the whole software development industry, we have to understand strategy, capability, and need as a balanced set of forces and allow patterns to emerge from that. Now, how we do that, I'm going to talk about later. But we need to take a much more evolutionary approach. In fact, we need to think of ourselves as evolutionary scientists, not as engineers. But I'd argue the concept of engineering is not necessarily the right concept or metaphor to apply to software development, because it implies known requirements and structure, which actually these days we don't have. It's much more of an ecological approach. Yeah? And the manufacturing metaphors are also basically flawed, because the whole concept of manufacturing is you have something you produce to a defined requirement. And we need to think far more in terms of software as a service relationship than a manufacturing process. So, for example, some of the work I'm doing at the moment with the Kanban community is to create a new way of reflecting requirements. You know, Kanban is a structured process. It implies linear causality. If you're dealing with a highly complex, ever-fluxing environment, we need to have a whole different way of doing Kanban, which is based on uncertainty. And there's a whole body of development going on that. I'll hint at some of this later as we go through. So there's nothing wrong with manufacturing where you've got a high degree of order. There's everything wrong with manufacturing where you've got uncertainty. Yeah, so service, manufacturing, uncertainty, certainty, complexity, order. Now, with sense-making comes, as I say, the concept of sufficiency. In order to understand what is sufficient, we need to understand what type of system we're in. And there are three basic systems which exist in nature: ordered, complex, and chaotic. Now, just to be clear, there is no absolute agreement on what these terms mean. Some people will talk about chaos for what I am talking about in terms of complexity. Different people use different language. The one thing we are all agreed on is that systems thinking is nothing to do with complexity thinking. So people who are used to systems thinking, systems dynamics, what's dominated the past 20 or 30 years, don't confuse that with complexity. The really big difference is in systems dynamics, people define a future state and try and close the gap. The whole idea is you say, where do I want to go and how do I close the gap? And that's a classic engineering approach. Where do you want the bridge? Yeah? Now, the reality is that in a complexity approach, we focus on describing the present and making changes in the present to see what is possible by interaction with the system itself. Much more experimental in nature. We move from the present forwards to discover evolutionary possibilities which we couldn't have anticipated. Yeah? That means, just to come back to software briefly, we need to start to think about object-oriented architectures in which applications emerge as a result of people's interaction with software objects over time. The applications are not designed up front. The day of enterprise-wide resource systems like SAP is over. They lack the dynamic flexibility to allow constant, rapid adjustment to changing circumstances, and they represent a technology which is already 20 years out of date in terms of capability. So I'm throwing out things in not necessarily in the right sequence here, but I'm trying to get a point across. So let's look at those three types of system. In an ordered system, we have a high degree of constraint so that all behavior is predictable. And human beings are really good at this. We know how to create order. So, for example, in hospitals these days, we count the number of surgical instruments left at the end of an operation and check it's the same as were there at the start. As I get older, I think this is of increasing importance. Yeah? You do not want to know how many surgical instruments were left in people's bodies before that checklist procedure was instantiated. The trouble is we get seduced by order and we want it all the time, even when it's inappropriate. So I worked for 7 years in IBM. If you work in IBM, you understand rigid bureaucracies. And there was a golden rule in IBM, don't buck the process. Yeah? If the process says you do it, do it. Don't argue with it. It doesn't matter how logical it is, whether it makes sense or not, whether it's good for customers. If that's what the process says, you follow it. As a result of which, the most important thing in IBM was your informal networks, because you had to find a way to work around the process to achieve the result that you wanted. So one of the things IBM did was they instituted a new system for scheduling. Now, to make it clear, I didn't volunteer to join IBM. I was conscripted. They bought the company I worked for. Yeah? And the first thing they did is to say our process for team allocation was extremely inefficient and wasted time. Yeah, people reported to people, people had conversations, teams were put together in conversations over a cup of coffee. That was considered extremely inefficient. So everybody was put into 3 massive resource pools, and everybody had to write their CV with their capabilities on it and put it into a database. Yeah? Those of us with any sense removed things like Fortran and COBOL from our CVs because we didn't want to know anybody to know we could do that stuff, right? That was becoming dangerous to have archaic skills, right? And then the idea was you had a new project, so you would fill out a project request form defining the skills you wanted over time. You would put it into the system, and the perfect team will be allocated to you. Everybody familiar with this type of approach? Okay, we took one look at it. This isn't going to work. So our 3 resource managers allocated themselves alternate hours throughout the day when only they could access the system. So nobody else would touch it. I would then phone up my friend Tony, and I'd say, Tony, I've got an interesting project, and I'm going to lead it. Now, Tony knows what I mean by an interesting project. It means it's on the edge of what is possible, and I haven't quite worked out how I'm going to do it yet, but I'm pretty sure I can find a way. If you're good at doing this, you get to do it for 40 years. If you're bad, you only do it once. Right? And I'm good at it. But he now knows this is going to be a scary ride for people who can't cope with uncertainty. And the fact I'm going to lead it as well, not delegate it to somebody else, means he's understood things I couldn't write down. So Tony finds a team of people who he thinks can do the job and work with me. And I trust Tony, so I don't argue with it. Yeah. He then creates their CVs, gets all their CVs down, and helps me write a requirements spec which exactly matches their CVs, and a project timetable which exactly matches their availability, which is also managed. During one of his hours, I then submit my request, and I get the team I want. Now, because in IBM everything is measured, a month later I get a form which says, are you happy with the team you got from the system? Now, I know that Tony's bonus is dependent on me being happy with the teams I get. So I say I was deliriously happy. Yeah. It is the major event of the last year. It's the most enjoyable experience I've had was to get this team. Yeah. And then a year later, we get an email from IBM which says, this is the most popular system we have instituted in the whole of the company. But certain deviant individuals are continuing to work around it, so we're going to spend $50,000 on further automation and structure. You see the nonsense? Yeah? People had taken order too far, so good people found a way to work around it. And I could give you lots of other examples. Yeah? If you over-constrain a system which isn't naturally constrainable, people will find ways to make the system work despite itself. So even though it appears very efficient on the surface, it will be very inefficient underneath. And there's a golden lesson in that for project managers, by the way. Yeah? If you're over-disciplinary, if you're over-structured, people will pretend they've achieved things even if they haven't. Yeah? Just to give you another thing we learned in IBM, at month end, when your project's overrunning, change the project codes on the final day of the month. Because everybody leaves it to the final day of the month to fill out their timesheets. So they won't be able to post time to your project, and therefore you'll get another 3 or 4 weeks of breathing space to catch up. If anybody doesn't know that one, it's a really good trick, right? It's entirely dependent on leaving people timesheets until the last moment, but they always do anyway. Right? Now, I'm giving all of those as examples, not because I'm an evil, malicious bastard, although some people in IBM thought I was, but because actually that's what good people always do to make the system work. You ever had that experience of meeting somebody in customer service who makes the system work despite the process, not through the process? Very common. In fact, one of the things, if you don't know it, is you can now game the system. I had a problem with the railway company in the UK. I messed up the website, so I didn't put in my senior citizen railway card. There are many pleasures to becoming 60. One is you get discounted travel. So I thought, well, it's only £10, but I'll make a fuss. So I write your website confused me, and therefore I want my money back. And they wrote back and said, sorry, we can't do that. Now, I know the way the system works. I know if I go through 3 complaints, it will get escalated to somebody. And the secret on the second complaint is to say, I'm happy to take a credit note. Because what they want is to close the complaints, because they're targeted on it. And lo and behold, this morning, after 3 complaints, I got my money back, together with a bonus award to shut me up and make me happy. Now, this is complete nonsense. If they'd done it on the first round, I'd have been very happy. But I know the process. People are locked into a rigid structure. Okay, I'll stop giving examples because you've all got the point. So nothing wrong with order, provided you don't take it too far. Chaos, in my definition, is randomness. There are no constraints whatsoever. Now, that's very difficult to maintain in a human system. Chaos doesn't happen naturally. Yeah? The minute you have a crisis, some sort of constraint will come into play. But if you can create a chaotic system, then you can get 2 major advantages. One is innovation. If you can remove all constraints for a short period of time, you get radical new ideas come through. But it takes a lot of energy, a lot of time. It won't happen naturally. The other, and we're increasingly using this, is a thing called wisdom of crowds, which is a bad name. With crowds are generally not wise. You're normally talking about the tyranny of herds, not the wisdom of crowds. But the concept here is a group of farmers guessing the weight of a cow. If all of them guess the weight without the knowledge of what the other farmers have guessed, then the average of all the guesses is generally the weight of the cow. The other case on this is an American submarine in the 1960s, grounded off the coast of Portugal. They gave partial data to groups of experts around the world, got all of them to estimate the position of the submarine without knowledge of who the other experts were. None of them got it right, but the average of all of the guesses was 150 meters away from the submarine. Now, there are sound cognitive science and statistical reasons why this works, but it requires for people to act completely independently of each other in real time. So actually, chaotic systems have huge value, but we have to put a lot of energy into creating them. And then we get complex adaptive systems, something we've only known about for 30 or 40 years. What happens here is the constraints partially modify behavior, but they are themselves modified by the behavior. So the constraints and behavior are co-evolving. They're constantly changing or fluxing over time. Now that means they're inherently unpredictable. An ordered system I can predict algorithmically. A chaotic system I can model mathematically. But a complex adaptive system I can't model or predict. The key thing to understand about a complex adaptive system is that fundamentally it has propensities and dispositions, but it doesn't have causality. Now that's a very difficult concept to get across, but it's a critical one. So in a complex adaptive system, there are things which are stable, which have propensities, which I can understand. Things in their nature which determine what they can do. And the current state of a complex adaptive system is its dispositions. And we measure those with fitness landscapes, something I'm going to talk about later. We can understand the present potential of the system, but we can't predict what will happen to it. So a simple metaphor here, think about a flat surface with a high coefficient of friction. Sorry, I get pedant sometimes, so I'm making my metaphor clear. Around the table, there are magnets which can change in polarity and strength. And on the table, there are effectively cast iron hockey pucks, discs. Yeah? Now, as long as all of the magnets keep the same strength and the same polarity, the discs will form a stable pattern. If I change one of the magnets, the discs will change in a predictable and repeatable way. And in systems dynamics, that is called a driver. And everybody knows what are the drivers of user behavior? What are the drivers of tester behavior? Right? The problem is if the system is a complex adaptive system, then actually the next time this magnet changes, 3 others change polarity and 5 others change strength. So the same thing never, ever happens again the same way twice except by accident. And the magnets are called modulators, not drivers. So a complex adaptive system is modulated, it's not driven, and it doesn't have linear material causality. You're always dealing with a current dispositional state without predictability of outcome. Now this is compounded in human systems by the fact that we have pattern recognition intelligences, not information processing devices. So for example, the most you scan of what's in front of you is about 3 to 4%. If you look at a radiologist, they scan 3 to 4% of an X-ray on a good day when they're focused. They'd be very scared by this, by the way. Yeah? They then match it against 30 to 40,000 patterns stored in their long-term memory associated with their skill and training as a radiologist. And the most frequently used patterns are nearer the surface of the brain, so they get activated first. So we evolved to make a first fit pattern match based on a partial data scan. Now in evolutionary terms, you can see the sense of this. If you think about the early hominoids on the savannas of Africa, something large and yellow with very sharp teeth runs towards you at high speed. Do you want to autistically scan all available data, look up a catalogue of the flora and fauna of the African veldt, and having identified lion, look up best practice case studies on how to deal with lions. By that time, the only document of any use to you will be the escape manual from the digestive tract of a large carnivore, and the only known example of that is the book of Jonah in the Bible, and I don't recommend building a practice based on that. Yeah? We evolved to make decisions very quickly based on partial data scans. So what happens when you launch a new software project? People scan 3 to 4% of what you say, and they match it against the patterns of the last few software projects. And guess what? People remember failure more than they remember success. Because in evolutionary terms, remembering failure has more evolutionary advantage than remembering success. So basically, PO4, in this wonderfully articulated, brilliant idea you've got, is being interpreted on a partial data scan against patterns of previous failure. On the other hand, if you start to build experimental probes, you start to work gradually, you take an evolutionary approach, which is what happened with social computing. Nobody designed the current system. It evolved from objects within an architecture. That's a key point, right? You can't understand in a predictive way a complex adaptive system. Yeah? Now, the basic argument behind this is dependent on what type of system we're in, we will manage it in a different way. So a complex system is different from an ordered system, is different from a chaotic system. Now, the best way I've learned to describe this is think about how you would manage a party for a bunch of 6-year-old kids. Can everybody imagine organizing a party for a bunch of 6-year-olds? Yeah? And you've made the mistake of holding it in your own house. You haven't yet learned that community centers are ideal for parties because they have fire hoses. And fire hoses are useful for two things. One is to clean up after the party, and the other is for crowd control during the party itself. Okay, so let's look at how we would organize a children's party based on what type of system we're in. So if we assume the system is chaotic, it means the children's behavior will be random, so they discover drugs and alcohol and go on a personal experience of self-discovery. Your house may burn down as a result, but all property is theft and it was socially constructed in the first place, so why are you worried about it? You'll either understand that stiletto or you won't. I don't recommend this. I've got friends in California who've tried it, but never more than once. The ordered systems approach, on the other hand, you'll be more familiar with. Under this, it's of critical importance to agree clear learning objectives for the party in advance of the party itself. The learning objectives should be aligned with the mission statement for education in the society to which you belong, and should be printed off on motivational posters with pictures of eagles soaring over valleys and water dropping into ponds, and the posters should be placed around the room where you're holding the party. You then produce a project plan for the party. The project plan should have clear milestones throughout the party against which you can measure progress against ideal party outcome. The senior adult should start the party with a motivational videotape. You don't want children wasting time in play which isn't aligned with the learning objectives. And then they should use PowerPoint to demonstrate their personal commitment to the party objectives and show the children how their allowances are linked to the achievement of the milestone targets. Following the highly successful completion of the party, you conduct the after-action review, update your best practice database on party management, and mandate future process improvements. If for any remote reason at this point the children aren't happy, you hire an appreciative inquiry practitioner who will get them to tell happy, clappy stories so they have happy mental models, and suitably indoctrinated, they'll like whatever you put in front of them next time. Everybody familiar with this approach to party management? The complex systems approach, on the other hand, is much simpler. We start off by drawing a line in the sand known as a boundary. We look the children in the eye and we say, cross that, you little bastards, and you die. And one of the things we learn pretty fast as adults is the value of flexible, negotiable boundaries, because rigid boundaries have a habit of breaking catastrophically. We then introduce catalytic probes, a video game, a computer, a football, a barbecue, something to see if a pattern of play will emerge, which is called an attractor. If it's beneficial, we give it more resource. If it's negative, we take the resource away. So we manage the emergence of beneficial coherence within attractors, within boundaries. And that's the great hope of complexity theory, because it basically says I can manage the probes, I can manage the boundaries, I can manage the amplification, but then I will see what is possible and I can reinforce very quickly. I manage emergent possibilities, not to defined outcomes. Yeah? Now that's a huge switch. It supports object-oriented architecture. It supports a very different approach to systems architecture and to systems development. And the IT profession is going to have to catch up with this fast, because we've got an increasingly computer-literate group of managers who won't tolerate the old ways much longer. One of the phenomena I'm seeing, the EU is one example, is actually non-IT managers being put into the IT management role because boards of companies have had enough of technology holding things back and they want a different approach. Yeah, so kind of like people know different things are possible, they're not prepared to take the old excuses. Yeah. So that requires us to take a different approach. And from this, we get to the Cynefin framework. So Cynefin takes order and it divides it into two, obvious and complicated. Now remember, ordered systems have high constraints, so they're predictable. That means there is linear causality, there is a right answer. The difference between obvious and complicated is in obvious, all reasonable people can see what that relationship is and accept it. So for example, in civilized countries, we drive on the left-hand side of the road. We could have chosen to drive on the right-hand side, but we've chosen to drive on the left. Yeah? So everybody drives on the left, it's accepted. That's the best practice domain. You know, we had options, we've chosen one, nobody argues with it, it's acceptable. So our model there is sense, categorize, respond, and effectively we've accepted or we've chosen to impose rigid constraints which don't tolerate deviation, and we can measure the results. Nothing wrong with that within boundaries. Complicated, on the other hand, it's not self-evident to anybody, so we have to do analysis or bring in expertise to find out what the right answer is. Yeah? So our model now is sense, analyze, respond, and we apply good practice, not best practice. That means people with the right experience and background can vary practice based on their own experience. So we allow a degree of, it's called loose coupling, less tight coupling. We allow some variation in things if you've got the right training and background, because we know we need that flexibility. So that's the good practice, best practice distinction. And because we allow flexibility, these are called governing constraints rather than rigid constraints. Yeah, in all cases we have constraint, but they're different in nature. Then we get a complex system. The only way you can understand a complex system is by interacting with it. Remember the children's party story? You can't plan it in advance. You can plan some things, but not the outcome. So I run probes, safe-to-fail experiments. I see what's possible. Different things will work on different times. Yeah? Yeah? I'm not quite sure whether I should mention football in Brazil, having sat in a beer cellar in Berlin with a certain match, so I'll try and hold away from that one, all right? But yeah, I realise it's sensitive at the moment, and you have to understand I'm Welsh, rugby is our national sport, we've had our own embarrassments as well, all right? So basically, what I've got here is enabling constraints. I understand, you know, I put some constraints in play. I don't run any experiment, but I run a series of parallel experiments to see what's possible. This is a switch from fail-safe design to safe-to-fail experimentation. And I run a portfolio of those experiments in parallel. Now, for those of you into Scrum, Scrum is not an example of this. Scrum takes one idea and iteratively tries to get it right. That's not the same thing as parallel safe-to-fail experiments. In fact, Scrum as a technique is not a complex technique. It's a technique to move complex into complicated. That's its great strength and its great value. Yeah? It's not a complex technique. It's a technique designed to shift things from there to there. Yeah? And then we get a chaotic system. In a chaotic system, you have to act decisively, either to maintain it or to reduce it. The first person to act controls the exit. And so basically here we have a complete absence of constraints. And here we have emergent practice. We can see the pattern of its evolution. Here we get completely novel practice, but that's an energy cost. Now, a lot of people in Agile have picked up Cynefin. But they tend to forget two things. They forget this domain. They're patterning trained around 2 by 2 matrices. The fifth domain on Cynefin is key. It's called disorder. It's a state of not knowing which of these systems you're in. And the whole concept is to reduce disorder to a minimum, because then you'll do things based on what you're most comfortable with. So disorder is a bad state. We also represent this boundaries as a catastrophic fold, because if you over-constrain a system which isn't naturally constrainable, tension builds up into the system until it finally breaks catastrophically. But the other thing everybody forgets is Cynefin is primarily about movements between domains. It's not a classification system. Yeah? And the trouble is, everybody in IT is into classification. If you don't know it, the two departments in universities with the highest degree of partial autism are finance and computer science, which actually is a major danger if you think about it. Yeah? Because you will tend to see things in different ways from the way a lot of the users will. It's a big advantage, by the way, because of the attention to detail, but it can be dangerous. So fundamentally, you get people who say, well, Scrum is complex, Waterfall is complicated, by which they imply Scrum is good, Waterfall is bad. Well, actually, there's nothing wrong with Waterfall design techniques. Yeah, they're very good for long-term defined requirements in an ordered space. And I've seen companies who've adopted Agile because Agile is now the way. You know, it's the way, the truth, the life, the answer to life, the universe, and everything. So everybody has to be Agile. So they've developed one-year sprints. Yeah, and that's actually an example of human beings finding a way around the system, because there's no point in arguing with it. All right? There's nothing wrong with Waterfall down here. In fact, it's the right thing to do. Yeah? And the idea that some methods are complex and others are complicated, that doesn't work. Yeah? And I've seen people say, my method is complex, yours is ordered, therefore I have more value than you do. And then you get the real idiots. There's one systems architect who is very prone to this. He's a wizard because he operates in the chaotic space and he's way ahead of everybody else, right? Now this is just nonsense, right? The reality is the fundamental dynamic that you want is a dynamic which constantly oscillates between complex and complicated. This is a stable state. Patterns emerge here through parallel safe-to-fail experiments. As they stabilize, they shift across to complicated, which means I can exploit them. Because basically this is exploration, this is exploitation. So I say Scrum shifts things across that boundary. Now just to be clear, I'll come back into this in a minute, it can only shift things which are already close to the boundary, because it requires users to have some definition of what they want. So actually it's a boundary transition method, it's not actually a method for this space. And I'll talk in a minute about pre-Scrum methods in the Agile framework, which is where we focus. Yeah? Not to say Scrum is wrong, but you need to do stuff first. But then periodically you need to disrupt things, but you want this dynamic stability. I presume everybody here has ridden a bike in their lives? A bicycle? Anybody tried to ride the bicycle very slowly? You fall off. Try and ride the bicycle too quickly, you fall off. Yeah? You want something between the two. So actually maintaining that dynamic flow is key. Go too slowly, companies break. Go too quickly, you lose everybody in the process. And actually there's a variation on that. There's a natural tempo or cadence to any company in terms of what's sustainable. Every now and then you won't do the dynamic change fast enough, so you need to do a radical reset. That's called a shallow dive into chaos. Take all the constraints away briefly to allow completely novel patterns to emerge. Now, if you do that, it's partly an admission of failure, but it's a necessary